The noon sun blazed over the small frontier town of Dust Creek, turning the dirt road into a shimmer of gold and heat. The townsfolk had gathered in the square, their faces tight with curiosity and fear. At the center stood a wooden post, and against it was tied a young woman, her wrists bound, her dress torn, her face streaked with sweat and dust. Her breath came shallow, trembling with exhaustion. Around her, the crowd murmured, waiting for the order that would begin her punishment. They said she had defied the sheriff, that she had hidden a man the law called an enemy, but the truth was quieter, buried under fear and pride. Just like most truths in Dust Creek, the whip hung loose in the sheriff's hand, its braided leather dark and cruel under the light. He was a man who believed order came only through pain, and mercy was a weakness that spread like disease. He spat into the dirt, turned toward the crowd, and barked for silence. His voice carried deep and sharp. "Justice," he said, "ain't mercy. And today she'll learn the difference." The people stirred, uneasy. Even those who hated the sheriff's ways kept their eyes low. Dust Creek was the kind of place where silence was safer than conscience. The young woman's gaze searched the faces around her, desperate for one hint of compassion, one sign that someone might speak. But none did. The wind lifted her hair and carried the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. Steady and loud, she remembered the moment everything changed. The night before, when she had heard a horse stumble behind her barn, she'd gone to see. There, half buried in shadow, she'd found him, an Apache warrior. Wounded, his breath shallow, his arm bleeding from a bullet. He'd looked up at her without fear, only calm, as if he knew she would not turn him in. She should have screamed or run or fetched the sheriff like any loyal citizen, but something inside her refused. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was rebellion. Or maybe it was the simple truth that she had seen too. Much cruelty in that badge to trust the word justice anymore. She had brought him water, tore her own skirt to bandage his wound, and told him to stay hidden until dawn. But dawn came too soon. Someone saw the tracks, and by morning the sheriff's men were at her door. They found no warrior, only the traces of her kindness. That was enough to condemn her. Now, as the sheriff's shadow stretched long across the dust, she tried to whisper a prayer, though her throat was dry. The crowd waited. The blacksmith leaned on his hammer handle, the preacher looked down at his boots, and the sheriff lifted the whip. The sound of leather-cutting air cracked like thunder. She flinched, but the first strike never came. A strange stillness fell, sharp as the pause between heartbeats. The people turned their heads toward the edge of town. From beyond the dry ridge where the heat shimmered like smoke, a figure appeared, tall, steady, moving with the rhythm of a man who feared nothing. Dust lifted around his boots, and sunlight flashed on the blade at his side. The sheriff's hand froze midair. Every whisper died. The Apache warrior had come back. His eyes swept the crowd like a storm scanning the plain. He saw her, tied to the post, her face pale and bruised. His jaw tightened. The scars on his arm, half healed from the night before, caught the light. He didn't rush. Every step he took was measured, silent, but the weight of his presence rippled through the people like wind through dry grass. Men who had faced bandits and war suddenly felt small. The sheriff's grip tightened on the whip. "You're a long way from your hills, Apache," he said, voice trying to sound firm but cracking just slightly. "Turn around while you still can. This ain't your fight." The warrior didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the woman, the same woman who had risked everything to help him. Her breath caught as he stopped a few steps away, close enough for her to see the cut above his brow, the dirt on his skin, the steadiness in his eyes. "I told you to go," she whispered, voice trembling. "They'll kill you." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "They already tried." The sheriff's men shifted, uneasy. Someone in the crowd muttered a curse. The warrior's calm was unnerving, as if he didn't see an army of rifles or the gallows behind the courthouse, only her, bound and trembling. "What are you doing here?" she asked again, her voice barely more than breath. He said nothing. But the answer was written in his silence. The sheriff stepped forward. "I said this ain't your business." The warrior's eyes moved to him, then slowly, like a wolf measuring distance before a strike. "You make her bleed," he said, his tone low, steady, and I make you remember it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff laughed, a short, ugly sound, trying to hide the flicker of fear in his eyes. You think you can scare me, savage? The warrior didn't reply. His hand brushed the hilt of his knife, not as a threat, but as a promise. The air seemed to thicken. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The woman closed her eyes, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The Apache warrior took another step forward, and the crowd instinctively moved back. Dust rose between them like a thin veil, catching the sunlight. The sheriff's whip fell from his hand. "Get back!" one of the deputies shouted, raising his rifle. But before he could steady his aim, the warrior moved fast, silent, like a shadow breaking free from the earth. In one motion, he drew his blade, the edge flashing as it caught the light. The rifle dropped, clattering into the dirt. The people screamed, scattering. Horses reared, hooves pounding against the ground. The woman twisted against her ropes, her voice lost in the chaos. The sheriff stumbled back, his confidence gone. "You'll hang for this," he yelled. The warrior didn't stop. He reached the post, cut her free with one clean strike, and caught her before she fell. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. His arm around her felt steady, like the earth itself. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you did what they never would," he said quietly. Gunfire cracked through the air. A bullet struck the ground near his feet. Another whistled past his shoulder. The sheriff's men were regrouping, shouting orders. The warrior lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the sound. "Run," he said. "I can't," she began, but he pulled her close, his voice firmer now. "You must." He turned, placing himself between her and the gunman. The wind carried the smell of smoke and fear. The crowd had fled, leaving only the echoes of their panic and the sound of gunfire growing closer. She looked at him one last time, her throat tight with something she couldn't name: gratitude, fear, hope, and then, as another shot rang out, the scene blurred in dust and fire. The Apache warrior stepped forward, shielding her with his body, and the town of Dust Creek became a storm of chaos and courage. The sheriff's voice shouted through the smoke, but his words were lost in the roar of the wind and the thunder of hooves somewhere beyond. When the dust began to settle, no one could see clearly who had fallen, who had fled, or who had survived. Only one thing was certain: the story of that day would not be forgotten, because in a town built on fear, one act of defiance had shaken everything. And somewhere in that wild silence, an Apache warrior had changed the course of Dust Creek forever. The smoke lingered over Dust Creek long after the gunfire had stopped. The townsfolk hid behind their doors, peeking through shutters as silence crept back across the square. No one dared to step outside, not after what they had seen. The sheriff's men were down, some wounded, some worse, and the sheriff himself had vanished behind the stable, clutching his bleeding arm. The air still carried the sharp scent of gunpowder and fear. Only the wind moved freely, sweeping through the empty street where just minutes before, justice had turned into chaos. Beyond the edge of town, the Apache warrior led the woman into the shadows of the desert. Her breath came heavy, and her steps stumbled against the uneven ground, but he held her steady, his hand firm around hers. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was thick, filled with questions neither dared to ask yet. Finally, when the town lights had faded behind them, she whispered, "They'll hunt you now. Both of us." He didn't slow. They already were. His voice was calm, like a river flowing over stones, quiet but unshakable. She studied him in the dim light, wondering how a man who had just faced a dozen rifles could move with such steadiness. His eyes didn't carry fear, only purpose. She wanted to ask his name, but somehow it didn't feel right yet. Names belong to a world of introductions, of safety and civility things. Far away from what they were living now, they stopped near a dry creek bed, where the moonlight painted the sand silver. He crouched down, checked the ground, and nodded once, satisfied. We rest here." Her knees gave out as soon as he said it. The rough journey had taken its toll. The ropes had left red marks on her wrists, and every muscle ached. He noticed, but said nothing, only unwrapped a small bundle from his belt and handed her a piece of dried meat. She hesitated, then took it. "Hunger beat pride tonight. You saved my life," she said quietly after a while. "But you didn't have to come back." He looked up at the stars before answering. "You saved mine first." Something in the way he said it made her heart tighten. She remembered that night again, the blood, the fear, the choice she made. Back then, she hadn't known who he was, only that he was hurt and human. Now, sitting across from him, she began to see the weight he carried. There was history in his eyes, something older than this land, older than the town that had nearly killed her. "Why were they chasing you?" she asked, her voice soft. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "They took my brother," he said. "Said he stole cattle. But he didn't. He was only hunting where our fathers hunted. They shot him when he ran." His gaze hardened. "I buried him in the canyon and swore I'd find the one who gave the order." Her chest tightened. "The sheriff." He nodded once. "Him." The fire between them flickered, throwing small sparks into the night. She thought about the sheriff's cold eyes, the whip, the way the crowd had watched her suffer without a word. It all made sense now. The sheriff's cruelty had a pattern, a reason buried under hate and pride, and she had been caught in it. "What will you do now?" she asked. He poked the fire with a stick. "He won't stop. He'll come again. For me, for you, for anyone who stands in his way." Her stomach twisted at the thought. She looked back toward the faint glow of town far in the distance. "Dust Creek isn't kind to those who fight back," she said. He met her gaze, and for a moment, quiet between them grew heavier. Then maybe it's time someone was. Morning came pale and cold. The desert stretched out in all directions, endless and still. When she woke, he was already on his feet, scanning the horizon. His presence felt both like a shield and a warning. "We move before the sun rises too high," he said. "They'll send riders." She followed without complaint, her mind replaying every sound from the night before the gunfire. The screams, the whip that never struck. She felt like she was walking through the remains of a dream that hadn't decided whether to end or turn into a nightmare. By noon, they reached the canyon. The place was carved deep into the land, with red walls that caught the light like fire. He stopped near a narrow path leading down to a hidden cave. "No one will find us here," he said. "Not yet." Inside the cave, the air was cool. The sound of dripping water echoed softly. He laid his satchel down, unrolled a small blanket, and began to clean the cut on his arm. She watched him for a moment before asking, "Does it hurt?" He gave a faint smile. "Not enough to stop me." She admired his strength, though part of her wondered what kind of life forged a man like him come under fire, silent in pain. She thought of her own life before all this. She had come to Dust Creek 2 years ago, chasing a rumor of work and a chance to start over. She'd found neither. The town had a way of swallowing dreams, leaving only dust behind. Now somehow, her fate was tied to a man who had every reason to hate the world she came from. And yet sitting there, she didn't feel fear anymore. She felt something else, a quiet pull, something deeper than gratitude. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. "Going somewhere no one knows you?" He glanced at her. "The land remembers," he said simply. "Even if I go, it follows." She didn't understand fully, but his words stayed with her. Outside, a hawk circled in the distance. He noticed, tensed, and motioned for her to stay still. She did. He moved to the entrance, eyes sharp. Moments later, faint hoofbeats reached their ears. Riders, the sheriff's men, were closer than they thought. He turned to her. "Stay inside. Don't make a sound, but promise me." He slipped out, disappearing into the brush. She pressed herself against the cool stone, every nerve alive. Through the thin crack in the rock, she could see shadows moving across the canyon rim. Voices carried through the wind. "Tracks end here," one man said. "He can't be far," another voice replied, cold and familiar. The sheriff. Search every inch. That savage won't escape me again. Her heart pounded. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. The sheriff was closer than she imagined. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The sound of boots and hooves echoed off the canyon walls. She tried to pray again, but her voice wouldn't come. All she could do was wait and trust that the warrior knew what he was doing. Then, from the distance, came a sudden cry. A horse neighed, a gun fired, then another. The canyon came alive with shouts and chaos. She couldn't see, but she knew he was fighting. Every shot made her flinch. She wanted to run to him, but her legs wouldn't move. Fear held her still. Finally, silence fell again. She strained her ears, but there was nothing except the wind. When he returned, his steps were steady, though his arm bled fresh. They're gone, he said. She looked at him, tears of relief in her eyes. You could have run. You could have left me. He sat down heavily, breathing deep. Not while you're still breathing. She didn't know what to say. He tore a piece from his own shirt and tied it around his wound. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who had learned long ago not to waste strength. As night fell again, she sat by the fire while he watched the horizon. The stars burned bright above them. What will happen now? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, the sheriff won't stop, but neither will I. She nodded, though fear coiled inside her. She knew he meant every word. When he finally looked at her, there was something softer in his eyes. You don't belong to that town, he said. You don't owe them anything. Don't have anywhere else, she whispered. He studied her for a long moment. Then you stay here, he said, until it's safe. But she knew there would be no safety. Not while Dust Creek still breathed under the sheriff's rule. The thought haunted her as the fire died down. Far away, thunder rumbled, though the sky was clear. Somewhere in the distance, the sheriff and his men were gathering again, plotting their next move. And in the canyon, two souls from different worlds sat in silence. Bound by fate and a promise, neither had spoken aloud. The night deepened, the desert whispering its secrets. She looked at the man across the fire and wondered what kind of story they were stepping into. Whatever it was, it had only just begun. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm. Though every hour felt heavy with uncertainty, the Apache warrior rarely spoke, but his silence carried weight. He would leave at dawn and return at dusk, always watchful, always scanning the horizon. The woman stayed near the canyon, gathering water from the narrow stream, keeping the fire alive, trying to make sense of the life that had become hers overnight. Each time she saw him disappear into the desert, a part of her feared he wouldn't return, and each time he came back, her heart settled for just a little while longer. One evening, he returned carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it down near the fire and unrolled it carefully. Inside were supplies, bread, salt, and a small pouch of bullets. She stared at them, realization dawning in her eyes. You went back to town, she whispered. He nodded once, his face unreadable. Only to the edge. The general store. They're searching further north now. Her stomach twisted. You risked everything for this? He looked up at her. You can't fight hunger, he said simply. She wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't worth it, but she couldn't. The warmth in his voice stopped her. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate, the kind of man who measured every risk before taking it. Still, she could sense something else beneath his growing tension. A shadow of anger that came when he looked toward the town. That night she dreamt of Dust Creek burning. She saw faces, she knew people who had turned away from her screaming as the sheriff rode through the smoke. When she woke, the fire had died, and the warrior was gone again. She stepped outside the cave, the cold air biting at her skin, and looked toward the east. The horizon glowed faintly, like a promise or a warning. By midday, he returned, this time with a different look in his eyes. They've taken someone, he said. They think he knows where we are. Her heart stopped. Whose boy? The blacksmith's son. She pressed her hand to her mouth. The blacksmith had been one of the few townsmen who ever treated her kindly. His little boy had once brought her water when she was working near the stables. She couldn't believe the sheriff would go that far. He's going to use him, she said quietly. The warrior's jaw tightened. He already is. He turned to gather his weapons. She stepped closer. What are you going to do? End it, he said, and his tone left no room for argument. But she caught his arm. You can't walk into Dust Creek alone. They'll kill you before you reach the square. He paused, looking down at her hand on his arm. Then I won't walk. Before she could protest, he was gone again, moving with the silent certainty of someone who had been hunted his whole life. She watched him vanish into the desert light and felt something rise in her chest, a mixture of fear and something harder to name. She had seen courage before, but not like this. This wasn't pride or vengeance alone. It was something deeper. As night approached, she couldn't sit still. The canyon walls felt too close, the silence too thick. Finally, she decided she couldn't wait. She packed a small satchel and followed his trail. The desert stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, but she kept walking. The moonlight guided her steps, and by dawn, a faint outline of Dust Creek appeared on the horizon. The town looked different now, tenser, darker. Soldiers from the nearby fort had arrived, their banners fluttering in the wind. The sheriff stood at the center, barking orders. She crept through the alleyways, her heart pounding. Every face she passed carried suspicion. She could feel the air thick with rumor. Inside the blacksmith's barn, she found the boy tied but unharmed. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. A voice came from behind her. I thought I'd seen the last of you. She turned. The sheriff stood there, a cruel smile curling under his mustache. You just can't keep yourself out of trouble, can you? He stepped closer, his spurs clinking against the floor. You think you can hide behind that savage forever? He can't protect you now. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to speak. You're afraid of him? The sheriff's smile faded. Afraid? No. I'm just tired of pretending men like him belong in our land. He reached for his gun, and anyone who helps them pays the same price. Before he could draw, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The window shattered as an arrow thudded into the wall beside him. The sheriff cursed and ducked behind a beam. She turned toward the sound there in the distance. The warrior stood at the edge of town, bow raised, eyes locked on his target. The sheriff's men shouted, chaos erupting. She grabbed the boy and untied his hands. Run, she whispered. Go to your father. Don't stop. The boy hesitated. What about you? Go, she repeated, pushing him toward the back door. Gunfire exploded in the street. She ducked behind the forge as bullets tore through the walls. The warrior moved like a shadow, vanishing between buildings, his arrows finding their mark with unerring precision. The sheriff barked orders, but his men were panicking. The sound of hooves thundered from the Northmore riders coming. In soldiers, the town was turning into a battlefield. She crawled out from the barn and sprinted toward the well in the center of town. The warrior saw her and shouted something she couldn't hear. The sheriff spotted her too and raised his rifle. She froze. A gunshot rang out. She flinched but didn't feel pain. The sheriff staggered, his rifle falling from his hands. The warrior had moved faster. He stood between them now, his knife glinting in the light. Get out of my way, the sheriff snarled. You took too much, the warrior said. Now it's over. But before he could act, the sound of boots filled the street. Soldiers poured in, rifles raised. The townsfolk hid in doorways, their fear palpable. The officer leading them shouted, "Drop your weapons!" For a moment, no one moved. The sheriff looked at the warrior, then at the soldiers, his face twisting into something between anger and relief. You're under arrest, he sneered. The warrior didn't move. His eyes shifted to her, softening for just a heartbeat. Then he raised his hands slowly, surrendering. Her breath caught. She wanted to scream, to tell them he wasn't the enemy. but the soldiers surrounded him before she could move. The sheriff brushed past her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Now we'll do this the proper way," he said. "Tomorrow at dawn, he hangs." The words struck her like a physical blow. The crowd began to gather again, just like before, faces drawn by curiosity, fear, and the promise of spectacle. That night, she slipped into the jailhouse, her steps quiet. The guard was asleep, a bottle tipped beside him. She found the warrior in a small cell, his wrists chained. He looked up when she entered, and even in the dim light. His gaze was steady. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I couldn't stay away," she whispered. She reached for the lock, fumbling with the keys she'd stolen. "I'll get you out." He shook his head. "If we run now, they'll burn every home between here and the river. Too many will die." Her hands trembled. "Then what are we supposed to do?" He looked through the small barred window toward the sky. Wait for the right moment. She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "You'll die if you stay." He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. "I've faced death before," he said softly. "But not like this." The key turned, but before she could open the door, the floor creaked behind her. She spun around. The sheriff stood in the doorway, gun in hand. "Well," he said with a cold smile, "ain't this touching?" She froze. The warrior tensed, every muscle ready. The sheriff raised the gun. "Should have run when you had the chance." And before she could speak, before the warrior could move, the light flickered, and the sound of boots echoed outside. Someone shouted from the street. A deep rumble shook the air. The townsfolk began to scream again. The soldiers' camp was on fire. The sheriff turned his head just long enough for the warrior to lunge. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small room. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the sheriff was gone, the door swinging open to chaos outside. The warrior was free, his chains shattered. He caught her hand, pulling her into the street. Dust Creek burned under the rising sun, somewhere within the smoke and shouting. Fate was still deciding which of them would survive to see the next dawn. Flames licked the rooftops of Dust Creek as the dawn wind fanned the fire into a wild storm. Smoke twisted through the narrow streets, turning the rising sun into a dull red glow. The townsfolk ran in every direction, shouting for water, for help, for mercy that would not come. Horses broke free from their stables, eyes wide with terror, hooves pounding against the ground. Amid the chaos, the Apache warrior and the woman moved through the smoke like shadows, one focused on survival, the other driven by something stronger than fear. She could barely breathe, the smoke burning her throat, but she didn't let go of his hand. Every step was a battle against the chaos around them. He moved with purpose, his eyes darting between alleys, searching for the sheriff. Somewhere in the town, that man still drew breath, and the warrior meant to end it. Behind them, a building collapsed, sending sparks raining into the air. The noise made her flinch, but he didn't stop. His face was set, cold, determined. She had seen men fight before, but not like this. This was something else, something that came from the deep scars of loss, something that couldn't be reasoned with or quieted by words. They reached the edge of the old mill, its wheel turning slowly in the creek that cut through the town. The fire hadn't reached here yet, stopped, scanning the ridgeline above the rooftops. "He'll run," he said quietly. "He always runs when the fire gets close." She caught her breath, gripping his arm. "You don't have to do this." He looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. "You saw what he did," he said. "You know there's no other way." She shook her head, tears welling despite the heat. "If you kill him, they'll call you the monster he said you were." His gaze lingered on her face, torn between vengeance and the strange calm she brought him. "Then let them," he said finally. He turned to leave, but she stepped in front of him. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling. "Can't win this fight alone." His jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to win," he said. "I'm trying to finish it." Before she could speak again, a gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the post beside her, splintering wood. They both dropped to the ground. Across the street, through the rising smoke, the sheriff emerged, his coat torn, his face streaked with soot, but his grin still cruel. "You can burn the town," he shouted, "but you can't burn me out of it." The warrior pushed her behind a trough and fired back, the shot ringing through the chaos. The bullet missed, grazing the sheriff's arm. The man laughed, ducking behind a wagon. "You think you're a savior?" he called out. "Oh, you're just another wild dog biting at the hand that feeds you." The warrior's eyes darkened. "You've fed on blood for too long." More shots echoed, each one shattering the quiet that had once ruled Dust Creek. Townspeople who hadn't fled crouched in doorways, clutching their children, too afraid to move. The fire roared around them, swallowing the saloon and the church steeple in the same hungry breath. The woman pressed herself against the ground, hands over her ears. She could feel the weight of everything, the fear, the anger, the helplessness of knowing that no matter who won, nothing would ever be the same. The warrior reloaded, his movements quick and sure. He peeked over the trough just long enough to see the sheriff limping toward the blacksmith shop, gun still in hand. He motioned for her to stay put, then slipped through the smoke. She wanted to stop him, to call his name, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was watch as his figure vanished again. Inside the shop, the air was thick with heat. The fire had reached the edge of the building, flames creeping along the beams. The warrior stepped carefully, his knife drawn, eyes adjusting to the dim light. Or somewhere inside, the sheriff's boots scraped against the floorboards. "You think you can take justice into your own hands?" the sheriff shouted. "You're no better than the animals you run with." The warrior said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Then, a sound came from behind him, a door creaking open. He turned just in time to see the woman slipping into the building. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "You can't do this," she whispered. "Not like this." He frowned, shaking his head. "Go back." But she stepped closer. "If you kill him, you lose everything you fought for." Before he could reply, the sheriff fired again. The bullet missed by inches, tearing through the sleeve of her dress. She screamed, ducking behind a beam. The warrior lunged forward, tackling the sheriff to the ground. The two men crashed through the doorway, rolling in the dirt outside as the building behind them caught fire. The struggle was brutal, desperate. The sheriff fought like a man who refused to die, clawing for his gun, striking with wild fury. The warrior moved with precision, each motion guided by instinct. Dust and blood mixed under their boots as they grappled in the middle of the burning street. The woman ran toward them, shouting for them to stop, but neither heard her. The world had narrowed to the sound of fists, the crackle of fire, and the echo of everything that had brought them here. The sheriff caught the warrior across the jaw with the butt of his gun, staggering him. "You think saving one woman changes what you are?" he spat. "You'll always be a savage." The warrior wiped the blood from his mouth and looked up at him. "You'll always be a coward." The words hit harder than any blow. The sheriff raised his weapon again, but the warrior was faster. He knocked it aside, sending it clattering into the dirt. They stood facing each other, both breathing hard, both knowing only one would walk away. In the distance, thunder rolled. The wind shifted, pushing the fire toward them. The flames climbed the sides of the general store, sparks falling like rain. The woman ran forward, grabbing the sheriff's discarded gun. Her hands trembled, the weight of the weapon almost too much. "Stop," she shouted. "Please." Neither man moved. The warrior's chest rose and fell, his eyes locked on the sheriff. The firelight flickered between them, casting their shadows across the dust. For a moment, everything was still, the kind of stillness that comes right before the world breaks apart. Then came the sound of distant hoofbeats. Soldiers, reinforcements from the fort, drawn by the fire and the chaos. The woman's heart sank. If they arrived now, they wouldn't care who started it. They'd kill them both. The warrior glanced toward the sound, then back at her. His face hardened. "Go," he said quietly.
"Ow."
She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "Not without you." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "If you stay, you die. If you go, maybe one of us lives." The sheriff, clutching his wounded side, let out a hoarse laugh. "He's right, girl. He's nothing but death walking on two legs. Run while you can." The warrior turned toward him, rage and exhaustion warring inside him. For a second, the temptation to end it all right there almost took him. But then he looked at her distraught, trembling, alive, and hesitated. The ground trembled as the soldiers drew nearer, their torches burned bright against the smoke. The sheriff saw his chance and lunged for the fallen gun, his hand closing around the grip. The warrior reacted on instinct, tackling him again as the weapon fired. The bullet hit the ground between them, sending dust into the air. The woman screamed, dropping the rifle she held. She ran to them, but the fire surged behind her, the heat so intense she could barely stand. The warrior wrestled the gun from the sheriff's grasp and tossed it aside. The man gasped, blood running down his arm, his face pale with fury. "You can't stop what's coming," the sheriff hissed. "You'll die with the rest of them." The warrior leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Maybe, but not by your hand." The sheriff's eyes widened as the flames drew nearer, their glow reflecting in his pupils. The woman stood frozen, torn between running and staying. The sound of the soldiers' horses was deafening now, echoing off the burning buildings. The air was thick with smoke, heat, and fear. The warrior turned to her, his face streaked with ash. "When I tell you, run to the canyon," he said. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." She shook her head, sobbing. "I can't leave you here, you have to," he said softly. "For both of us." The soldiers' shouts grew louder. First torches appeared at the edge of the street. The town was collapsing around them, fire swallowing everything it touched. The warrior stood tall, the sheriff struggling to rise at his feet. The woman backed away, tears streaming down her face, her heart torn between survival and the man who had saved her life. And as the soldiers closed in and the fire raged higher, Dust Creek stood on the edge of its reckoning, caught between vengeance, justice, and the thin, trembling hope that somehow someone might still walk out of the smoke alive. The soldiers poured into Dust Creek like a storm, their torches blazing against the rising sun. The town was half burned, its streets covered in ash and shattered glass. The air trembled with the sound of horses and shouted orders, the kind of chaos that comes when fear wears a uniform. The Apache warrior stood in the middle of it all, the sheriff kneeling before him, beaten and broken. The woman watched from a few steps away, her chest tight, her heart fighting between hope and dread. The soldier at the front, an officer with gray in his beard, pulled his horse to a stop. "Drop your weapon," he commanded, raising his rifle. Now, the warrior didn't move. He looked at the woman, then at the soldiers surrounding them. The flames behind him painted the sky red. "This man killed my brother," he said, his voice steady. "And your law protected him." The officer frowned, lowering his rifle just slightly. "Whatever happened, it's not your justice to take." The sheriff groaned, coughing into the dirt. "He's lying," he spat. "He's a savage murderer. I was upholding the law." The warrior's jaw clenched. He reached down, grabbed the sheriff by the collar, and pulled him to his feet. "Tell them," he said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "Tell them what you did in the canyon." The sheriff shook his head, trembling. "He's mad," he said, his eyes darting toward the soldiers. The warrior pushed him forward, forcing him to face the officer. "Tell them who shot first," he said. "Tell them who buried my brother in the sand." For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind howled through the empty street, carrying the crackle of burning wood. Then, with the weight of defeat in his voice, the sheriff whispered, "He wouldn't drop his bow. I warned him." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You killed an unarmed man?" "It was trespassing," the sheriff muttered. That land was never yours," the warrior said. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. The truth hung in the air, raw and undeniable. The officer looked between the two men, then dismounted his horse. He stepped closer, his expression hard. "It's over," he said to the sheriff. "You're coming with us?" The sheriff's mouth fell open. "You can't arrest me. I run this town. Not anymore." The warrior released him, stepping back. The sheriff stumbled, his pride shattering faster than his strength. The soldiers seized him, binding his hands. He shouted curses, his voice echoing through the smoke. The officer turned to the warrior. "You have every reason for vengeance," he said. "But if you stay here, they'll find another reason to kill you. Take the woman and go, before we finish clearing this mess." The warrior looked at her, then at the dying flames that had once been Dust Creek. For the first time in days, he looked tired, bone-deep weary. "Where would we go?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. The wind caught his hair, carrying away the ashes that clung to his skin. "Some place where they can't find us," he said finally. The officer nodded once and stepped aside. "Then go." She reached for the warrior's hand, and together they walked away from the smoke. No one tried to stop them. The people who had once watched her punishment in silence now turned their eyes away, ashamed. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the desert, the town below was nothing more than a blur of smoke and broken buildings. She turned back one last time, her heart heavy. "Do you think they'll ever change?" she asked. He followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said. "But not for us." They traveled in silence for miles, the desert stretching endlessly before them. The sun climbed higher, washing the world in gold. By afternoon, they reached the canyon where they had hidden before. The land was quiet, untouched by the fire and noise that had swallowed Dust Creek. When they stopped, she knelt beside the small grave the warrior had made for his brother. She brushed away the sand covering the stones. "You kept your promise," she whispered. He stood beside her, his shadow long across the ground. "He deserved peace," he said. "And now, maybe he has it." For a long time, they said nothing. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was a kind of understanding. She knew he had carried more than pain all this time. He had carried duty, guilt, and the last piece of a world that was disappearing. Somehow, she had become part of that burden. When night fell, they built a small fire. The stars above stretched like rivers of light, endless and pure. The woman sat close to the flames, her arms wrapped around her knees. "What will you do now?" she asked. He stared into the fire.
Us.
"There's a village west of the mountains," he said. "My mother's people live there. I haven't seen them in many years." She smiled faintly. "I should go." He looked at her anew. She hesitated. "Don't know. Dust Creek was all I had. Now it's gone." He studied her face, then reached into his pouch and handed her a small, carved pendant. It was shaped like a hawk, its wings outstretched. "Keep this," he said. "It will remind you that you are free." Her fingers closed around it. "In you." He looked toward the horizon where the desert met the stars. "I'll find what's left of my people," he said. "And if there's nothing left to find, I'll start again." The fire crackled between them. She wanted to tell him to stay, to say that maybe they could start again together, but she didn't. Some things didn't need words. Some bonds were made not to hold, but to guide. When dawn came, the sky blushed pink over the canyon. They stood side by side, watching the lights spill across the land. "You saved me," she said softly. "Twice." He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I only gave you time." She smiled, though tears filled her eyes. "Then maybe time was all I needed." He turned to her, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "You're stronger than you think." She stepped closer. "Maybe, but I wouldn't have known it without you." He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her face, then lowered his hand. "If the world ever tries to break you again," he said, "remember this day." "I will," she promised. They stood there a moment longer, the morning wind moving softly between them. Then he took one last look at her and began walking toward the western ridge. She watched him go, her heart caught between sorrow and peace. Each step he took seemed to fade into the horizon until he became part of the land itself, a figure carved into the endless story of the desert. When he disappeared from sight, she turned back toward the valley. The smoke from Dust Creek had thinned, rising like a ghost of the past. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it lift from her chest. There was no going back. But somewhere beyond the horizon, there might still be a place to begin again. She stayed by the canyon for several days, tending to the land, marking the graves that the flames had left behind in memory alone. Sometimes she thought she heard the echo of footsteps, or the soft cry of a hawk circling above, and she would smile to herself, knowing he was still out there somewhere the world could not tame. In the weeks that followed, Dust Creek began to rebuild. New faces came, drawn by the promise of land and silence. The old sheriff's name was erased from the records, his deeds buried with the ashes. Some said the warrior was still seen at night on the ridge above town, watching but never entering. Others said he had vanished into the mountains, leaving behind only stories whispered around campfires. For her, those stories were enough. She carried them like a compass, guiding her every step. The pain of what had been slowly turned into something else, something like strength. She found work with the settlers rebuilding the town, teaching children, planting seeds where the fire had burned deepest. And when the nights were long and quiet, she would sit by the edge of the desert, the carved pendant in her hand, and listened to the wind. Sometimes, when it blew from the west, she could almost hear his voice in it. Calm, certain, unbroken. The town that once stood for cruelty and silence began to change. People learned to speak up, to look after one another. And though few remembered how it began, those who were there never forgot the day a man from the mountains came down to face the fire. He had come to take vengeance, but had left something greater behind. A lesson, a promise, and a piece of hope buried in the ashes of Dust Creek. The woman never saw him again, but she didn't need to. She knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, under the same sky they once shared, the Apache warrior was free, and so was she.